Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, for coming to this, the launch of a new group that we hope will bring new energy, new power to the effort to bring to account those who are responsible for crimes against humanity, against an extremely vulnerable people. I'm talking about the Rohingya people who have lived on the border of what is now Bangladesh and Myanmar for many years, for centuries. I'm Veronica Pedrosa, and I am a journalist who worked for Al Jazeera English most recently for 10 years, but prior to that I worked at the BBC and at CNN. My interest here is because since 2012, when the most recent outbreak of violence happened, I've followed the story of the Rohingya from Kuala Lumpur and from Bangkok across the region. I've also spent the last, well, on and off 3 months there since the events of August the 25th took place. I worked for a month as a consultant for the United Nations Population Fund, and as such was working particularly with women on gender-based violence in particular, and also on reproductive health issues. This was in October. I also did some investigations on a freelance basis as a journalist. As a member of the media, I also want to reach out to those of us who are in the media today, who are following perhaps over the internet or in the room, and to those of you who might wish to spread the word. We'd be very grateful if you would through your own networks. It's one of the joys, I suppose, of technology and social media, that we can reach directly into people's lives, like reaching over your neighbor's fence. The only issue is making sure that the information that we give them is good, right? Because we have so many issues now with fake information. And in this particular issue, there have been a lot of manipulations from different sides, which has caused a lot of unhappiness. And for me, at the heart of the story are very vulnerable people. And it's them that matter. And the people who are manipulating the story, I think, are being very selfish. And they are not going to the heart of the matter. It should be about giving them voices. And that is my kind of position. And that's why I would like to thank very much people who are launching Justice for the Rohingya Minority today for inviting me to host this event and also to be a member of the steering committee. Let me... Hello. I'd also like to tell you a little bit about how JFRM, as we're calling it, is different from the many other groups that are involved in supporting and expressing solidarity for Rohingya. I'm interested in it because it is so sharply focused. It is specifically to explore and exhaust all legal avenues so that the people who perpetrated crimes against humanity are brought to account for them. That is a very broad statement. There is a lot to be done in order to achieve that. And there are lots of people who are working on different aspects of it. There's documentation, of course. There are the legal aspects. There are the legal terms by which perpetrators could be charged. But I hope that with our panel of experts lined up today, who are very distinguished, we can explain that a bit better to everyone. And hopefully you can think of ways that you and the people that you know can fold into the work that we're doing, and not argue with each other or compete with each other in some sort of rivalry and overlap, but that we're working kind of in parallel, kind of integrated in order to help the Rohingya. I don't know, if I could have a show of hands of people who have been to Rakhine State. How many is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And how many have been to Bangladesh, to the refugee camps? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, 7, 8. 7, 8. I can't, there have been so many column inches and so many sort of ones and zeros on the digital internet that have been exhausted in describing that in lots of poetry, lots of prose that is extremely moving, and some of it that is just really, really difficult to read. But for me, because I've been campaigning on this since 2012, the impact for me is not just the magnitude of the disaster. The international humanitarian community is trying to provide for 1.1 million people that have arrived over the years. There's that, and then there's the depth of the misery. In every tent, everybody has a tragedy to tell. Tragedy, I'm afraid, is a bit of a cliche, it might be a bit overused, but these are people who have lost everything, including their dignity, including their humanity. You're talking about trauma on a mass scale. So it's just this magnitude, and there's this depth, and there's also, for me, a kind of guilt. Why couldn't we have stopped it? We told everyone, as many people as we could, about what was happening. It was almost inevitable that we would get to this point. And people were listening, but nothing happened. And I really want something to happen now. Now people know the name Rohingya. Now people will use the word Rohingya. They really exist, I think, in the public imagination. But I would really like something to be done so this ends now. There is no reason for this to be happening except for the perpetrators within the Myanmar establishment who have made it happen. Thank you very much for listening to me, Babylon. It is just a small start to the legal work. We welcome all ideas and suggestions, and of course collaboration where possible, as I've already mentioned. I'm going to run through the schedule, but first of all let me say we have a few apologies. We did expect to have Rushanara Ali MP. Unfortunately, she has had urgent parliamentary business to attend to. Peter Oborne, who I met in Cox's Bazar initially, looking like a very sort of lost Englishman with his white linen jacket, but he came out with an extraordinary story after that, because he believes this is genocide, what's happening in Cox's Bazar, after what he's seen and what he's heard. Anyway, he's travelling, but we did expect him to come here. And Tun Kin of the British Burma Rohingya Organisation of the UK cannot make it. However, we do have in his stead another young man to join us, Nizamuddin, over there. I'll introduce everyone properly a bit later. Also, Catherine West MP was going to come. She is fully supporting what we're doing, and in fact, she's written a short statement with her apologies. She says, "I am sorry I can't be with you tonight, but important votes are taking place on the data protection bill, and that means I need to be in Parliament. The appalling situation for the Rohingya community in Burma was something I raised on many occasions during my time as shadow foreign minister, and now from the backbenches. More than 640,000 people have fled Rakhine State for Bangladesh, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has described the situation in Rakhine State as an example of ethnic cleansing. Those responsible for these actions must be held accountable, and pressure must be focused on the Burmese authorities to not only bring a complete end to all violence, but to secure the rights and citizenship of the Rohingya people and ensure full humanitarian access and support for those affected. Another couple of points. We do appeal to you and any friends that you know who might be able to support us with funds. We are completely reliant on donations and the goodwill of people. Please support us by filing a standing order form, which is on the back of the brochure, which I hope you got a hold of at the reception when you registered. Or you can give your details with volunteers at the registration desk at any point through the evening. We're also recruiting volunteers and interns. Please give your details again at the registration desk. I guess I could get my son to do that over the summer for you, if that's all right, Dr. Abdullah. And we'll have anyone who has queries from the media or representing the media, please do contact Dr. Abdullah Falik. He's the CEO of Justice for the Rohingya Minority. I'd like to move on now and introduce the first of our speakers. He's sitting right there. You can speak from there or from there. Jason McHugh is going to talk about the legal routes and options to help the Rohingya. Just to let you know, he is with. Oh, excuse me, I'm looking at the wrong.
Don't worry.
It's all right. You're with McHugh
and Partners.
And Partners.
Name. Yeah. An imaginative name.
It's an imaginative name, yes, McHugh and Partners, who JFRM are
we're their advisors,
advising us on how to proceed along these legal avenues of which I speak. So,
sure.
Without being too jargonistic.
No. Hello, everyone. First of all, I just want to congratulate the JFRM for providing focus to the issue of justice, because justice will not change the cultural problem that the Rohingya are facing, but it will change the international community, and it will start changing the regime's attitude if it's pursued. I also want to thank you all for being here tonight, because what they need and what this group needs is support. It needs huge public support. It needs the support that this sort of event, and better, not to listen to an idiot like me, but to listen to some of these people here, should be filling Wembley Stadium. Such is the issue. And one of the biggest challenges we've got is to take it out of this room and to get it into a stadium, because that's where it belongs. Now, what this group's going to do is it's going to ensure that every legal stone is turned over and looked at. And that's the promise we're going to do, and that's the goal. The reason for that is that it's been very frustrating for the people and the victims to have to sit by and see the international community do very little. They do very little, and it's a mixture of politics, as you all know, Security Council politics, it's a mixture of bureaucracy, whatever, precedents being set, finance, etc. But what I do know is that when people start looking after themselves and start using law and the rule of law to actually push matters along, the international community do start listening, because they have to. They get shamed into moving at a better pace. So one of the objectives of this group is to show to the international community, if it smells like genocide, looks like genocide, it is genocide. And if they won't give us the legal definition, then we'll find another route of doing it. Now, one of the things and approaches we're going to look to on this, on seeking justice, and we're looking for accountability, we're looking for reparations, all of those words. One of the approaches we're going to do to this is looking at the reasoning, because sometimes when you look at the reasoning, you find avenues of justice that you first of all didn't appreciate were there. It's pretty obvious the ethnic and religious divisions that have caused this. Perhaps less so obvious to some people is the commercial side of this. There are direct correlations here that we're looking at between the regime with commercial partners, commercial companies, international companies, hand in hand with the regime, seeking commercial profit and opportunity from lands that the Rohingya have been moved from. Now, I suspect when we start looking at this and start looking at actions, these sort of cases are going to cause the regime and those who support it real problems. Hit them where the money is. Try and get the money for the people who deserve it and who have suffered. And we're going to be looking at that. There's also other aspects on the reasoning that you'll be aware of. The regime keep coming back saying, you're all the Rohingya, Islamic terrorism, security, we have to do this. This is a load of nonsense. This is used as an excuse. It does not excuse ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, etc., etc. It's made up, and it's made up to justify their acts. Now, one thing from actions, and actions a group of us here have brought around the world, is exposing these false flag terrorist claims in courts of law and knocking them down for the nonsense they are. That can actually achieve progress. Now, I think it's unquestionable that in this room and around the world now, because of the work of the media with the Rohingya people and their supporters, that we're in a position where we know a wrong has been done to the people. It's unquestionable. It is ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes. Have they suffered loss and damage when you're looking for legal actions? Of course they have. Huge. I don't need to go into it. Other people at the table will do it. What's important from the actions available is that we look to create security for the Rohingya, create justice and accountability, and reparations. Now, how do you do that? Quickly, I'm just going to briefly run over them. The more traditional legal approaches are to look for domestic actions that can be brought. Well, in a country, in Myanmar, where the Constitution of 2008 don't even give citizen rights and give immunity to human rights abuses past and present, I don't think we're going to get a fair trial there. So I don't think we're even going to waste our time. Then you have to look at international platforms, and Ben is going to go through that with you, but you're aware of the conventions and the ICC and how we can rely on these and get definitions which can create actions by the international community. We're also going to look, and I think, are you going to touch on the universal jurisdiction point? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that saves me. If the international community doesn't pull its weight, then there's ways where, as a private group, we can push through universal jurisdictions in countries such as Canada or New Zealand, even the UK to some extent, to get those definitions, to drive and embarrass people into action. Lastly, I just want to talk about more modern asymmetric approaches and options of getting justice, which are on the table. One of the ones that we're quite proud, and some of our team are here today pushing, was private prosecution packs. What these are is we created, against key figures in different regimes, a prosecution pack of evidence and procedure, which we then set up in internet platforms around the world, which lawyers and NGOs in countries where we knew the regime figures visit, where their money is, whatever it is, or where they go for business or state affairs, we'd have it ready to start private prosecutions the moment they step foot there. That is something we're going to look at. It will mean that the regime figures will have a de facto travel ban on them because they'll be frightened to move around so easily. And it works.
What do you mean exactly by a pack?
Well, basically, what we do is the problem when someone steps foot in a country, if you get a bad guy who turns up in a country, let's say Adolf Hitler decides in 1942, or whatever, it's a bad example, but someone bad arrives. The problem is everyone who wants to see that guy prosecuted, the police are too slow. Sometimes politics, the government is having those people in for a peace process, so they keep it behind closed doors, they don't publicize it. An activist or a lawyer will find out, they then have to put papers together to go to court, affidavit evidence. That takes days to do, and by the time they've done it, they've gone. Someone's escaped justice. We create a mechanism which practically means everything is there, ready to go, and friends, fellow lawyers who will all combine in this campaign in jurisdictions that we know the regime figures visit will have these packs sitting, waiting. And you create a network to inform them. This is something we're going to look at. It's effective, it works. The next thing we're going to look at, and I touched on it before, was these transnational corporations. The regime are using that to fund the regime. They need the money to stay in power and carry on what they're doing. Hit their funds, hit their partners walk away, they don't have money, they crumble, they can't persecute in the same way. I think we also need to look at how organizations, let me put it this way, when you have someone persecuted, it starts by discriminatory laws. The next minute you know, you've got human rights abuses. It's a cycle of persecution. The next thing you know then, you've got, in that gap, terrorist movements moving in to fill the space in the chaos. And hand in hand with that are corporations who come along to reap it for natural resources, oil and gas, whatever, exploitation. It all happens because they all think they can get away with it. So one of the things the campaign must do is looking at all aspects on that spoke of persecution and dealing with each one. And one of the things where there's been abuse quite clearly here is in the use, unhindered and unmonitored, by Facebook. Facebook have allowed their service to be used in inappropriate ways and monitored by, what, some guys sat in Dublin. I'm not quite sure how they'd actually do the translations. And I think Zuckerberg admitted the same on the 10th and 11th of April. These are where we have to hit. We have to name and shame, we have to hit, we have to look at all these things and put forward cogent arguments and legal actions. I don't really have more to say. I think Ben's going to deal with all the international sides, so thank you.
I think that just a recollection that I have, if Matthew Smith of Fortify Rights doesn't mind my taking his name in vain, they've done extraordinary work researching, documenting human rights abuses in Burma and through talking to people in Bangladesh. And one of the things he said that he had found, that he'd heard through his connections, is that the Burmese military, the Tatmadaw, as they're sometimes known, is very worried about being prosecuted at the ICC. And, as a matter of fact, just taking up this initiative may prevent the next massacre. So that's something that we can all be, that we can all sort of be a part of. That we mustn't sort of drop that, because it is something that bothers them. Next, let's talk a bit more about what's going on, the latest update, about what's going on in Rakhine State and possibly in the camps itself. Nijam Uddin arrived in the UK in 2008 from a refugee camp in Bangladesh, where he lived for 18 years. But he was born in Rakhine State, which is also known as Arakan State, in Burma, but was forced to flee due to persecution. He is the General Secretary of the British Rohingya community in the UK. No, you can, if yeah. Nijam, if you don't mind, let me just make it clear to the audience that we'll be hearing from each of our distinguished panelists, one after another, and each will be speaking for about 5 minutes or so. Thanks.
Thank you. Good evening, chairs and delegates. I'm really grateful to you for giving me the opportunity to address this meeting, speaking justice for the persecuted Rohingya minority. I'm really grateful to the organizer of this meeting. I'm a Rohingya, I'm a Burmese from Arakan, and I'm a genocide survivor. Friends, I'm here in front of with you with a heavy heart. I'm upset, I'm almost hopeless. I'm seeking your hands of support and friendships for my people. We are stateless in our own country, the country that our forefathers lived for hundreds of years, the country where our forefathers were independence movement leaders, the country where our forefathers were MPs, ministers, and held important posts in the government. But today, we are stateless, unwanted, subjected to ethnic cleansing. We are at the mercy of a furious military junta and extremist Buddhist vigilantes. Our crime? we are ethnic minority. We had full citizenship. We had our homes, communities, villages, and business. We had job in governments, properties, and we had our school. Our forefather went to the Rangoon University, but today we are nobody. We are stateless in our own country. To understand what happened to us, you need to remember a timeline from 1784 to 1962. In 1784, Burmese king conquered Kingdom of Arakan, homeland of the Rohingya people. In 1826, Arakan ceded from Burma and joined British India. In 1886, Britain defeated the Burmese king and conquered whole of Burma, and Arakan became a province of British Burma. From 1942 to 1945, Japan conquered Burma from Britain during Second World War. Rohingya fought on site of Britain. Burma fought on site of Japan. Burmese army known as the Temudor was formed by the Japanese. In 1948, Burma given independence by the Britain with a clear pledge that all ethnic communities living in Burma in 1948 will be full citizens of Burma. In 1962, the Temudor dominated by the Burmese took power via military coup, and our misery started. Temudor hated us. Temudor supported the Japanese Imperial Army during the Second World War, and we the Arakanese Burmese supported Britain and the Allied forces during the Second World War. That is our crime. As soon as the military took the power, they started persecuting us because of our rule in the Second World War. In 1982, our Burmese citizenship was cancelled. We protested, we appealed to the world, but no response. Even Britain, that had a responsibility for us as a colonial master, did not speak out. What does it mean to be a stateless? In our own country, we cannot own any property or business. In our own country, we cannot travel freely. We cannot attend a state school or universities. We cannot marry without prior permission. We cannot have more than 2 children. We can only live in areas designated for us by the military. We are Rohingya, we are Arakanese Burmese. We supported Aung San Suu Kyi when she fought for the democracy. We knew only a democratic government will look after all the people of Burma, not the military. We supported National League for Democracy, NLD, which is Aung San Suu Kyi's party. In 1991 election, she got a landslide in Rakhine State, but she was not allowed to form a government, and she was put under house arrest. We campaigned for her release. Now she is free. She is the first state councillor of Myanmar. But today she remained quiet while the Rohingya villages are burning, while the Rohingya children are being killed, while the Rohingya women are being raped, while unarmed Rohingyas are being shot down like animals, while thousands of Rohingya are fleeing from their homeland because of terror and persecution. We are grateful to the Bangladesh, its Prime Minister and the people of Bangladesh for giving refuge to our people. Bangladesh has shown tremendous compassion and humanity. Without Bangladesh opening the border to the fleeing refugees, thousands of us would have been dead by now. This is the difference between Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina and the first State Council of Aung San Suu Kyi of Myanmar. The racism in Myanmar will not stop with ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya community. There are other minorities who are also at risk in Myanmar. The Christian in Karen State, the tribal communities on Mo and the Keshan State, non-Rohingya Muslim in Mandalay and Rangoon, and in the northern state all are at risk. Temudor and the extremist Buddhists believe in Mahaburma, thus meant Great Burma, based on a philosophy of Mahabharata. This is a supremacist Buddhist philosophy which preaches one religion, one culture, and one nation. Today, Myanmar has a very well-developed racist and fascist state machinery persecuting the Rohingyas. As a humanity, we need to stand up to the racist and fascist, and also to those countries and companies that make compromise with racists for contracts and access to resources, ignoring the human rights. Let us all campaign together, and together we will win too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nijamuddin. Now we'd like to turn to one of our key speakers today, Professor Penny Green, Professor of Law and Globalization at Queen Mary University of London and the head of the Law Department. She's the founder and director of the award-winning International State Crime Initiative. She's a distinguished visiting fellow at UN. I think that's the University of New South Wales and Ulster University, adjunct professor at Bezet University, also holding visiting fellowships at the University of Melbourne, etc., etc. But her most recent projects include Myanmar's genocide against its Muslim ethnic Rohingya population and forced evictions in Palestine/Israel. Her seminal work with ISCI colleagues on the Rohingya genocide is Countdown to Annihilation, Genocide in Myanmar 2015, and she's also written Genocide Achieved, Genocide Continues, Myanmar's Annihilation of the Rohingya 2018, and these have drawn widespread global attention. She's going to speak today about Rohingya persecution and the making of a genocide, and please take, I think, 10 minutes. Professor, if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organisers of this event and to JFRM for trying to bring together quite disparate groups who have been working in and around the Rohingya. I hope that this group will meet with some success. What I want to talk about a little bit is the research that we've done, because I think one of the things that's very important in a crisis like this is evidence and a clear thinking about exactly what's happened. And we hear much talk about the humanitarian crisis that the Rohingya are facing. We hear talk about ethnic cleansing. And I really want to challenge both those analyses. I think that certainly the Rohingya face a humanitarian crisis. But the crisis which has led them to this is a crisis of genocide. And I think it's very important to think like that because it reminds us of who the perpetrators are. It's the Myanmar state, it's the government of Aung San Suu Kyi and the military led by General Min Aung Hlaing. And I think it's tremendously important for us not to forget why it is that the Rohingya are now facing potential landslides, living in very overcrowded, squalid camps in very difficult conditions. And I don't want us to forget the Rohingya that remain imprisoned inside Rakhine State. There are at least 140,000 remaining in appalling camps. So they make the Bangladesh camps look like holiday camps, quite frankly. And there are still 140,000 Rohingya remaining in those camps just outside of the capital of Rakhine State, Sitwe, and in a ghetto inside Sitwe, Ongmingala. These are places of, they are places that are utterly reminiscent of Poland and Germany in the 1930s and early 40s. And I think that the comparisons have to be made. And one of the things that we were keen to do was to benchmark what happened to the Rohingya and what is happening to the Rohingya against historic genocides, and the parallels are very, very stark indeed. So I think it's tremendously important for us to challenge terms like ethnic cleansing. I mean, ethnic cleansing might describe at one level what's happening, but ethnic cleansing isn't a crime in the sense that genocide is a crime. This is genocide, and I liked what Jason said, that if it looks like, smells like, tastes like something, then we call it that something. And in this case, it is indeed genocide. We approached the persecution of the Rohingya, which we learnt about first, as Veronica mentioned, in 2012, when we were conducting other research on the regime and on the way in which civil society had resisted state persecution and state violence. We didn't know about the Rohingya at that stage, but we came to learn of them during that period. And what we learned was that this was a genocide very slow in the making, but definitely in the making over a period of 30 years. And by the time we began our explicit work on the Rohingya, it was clear to us that if we understand genocide as a process, and I think we absolutely have to understand it as a process, we've got to avoid being seduced by the idea that genocide is simply spectacularized acts of mass killing. This is not what genocide is. It can be, and often in part is. But it's also about the annihilation, the extermination of an ethnic identity, a religious identity, a national identity. And as Raphael Lemkin, who was the architect of the law and the term genocide, made so clear, the annihilation of a people can take place independently of mass killing, though mass killing is very frequently an element. And in the case of the Rohingya, by the time we visited for the purposes of researching the persecution of the Rohingya in 2014, the Rohingya were at the stage of what is known in the literature as systematic weakening. And if we think of genocide as a process which involves essentially 6 stages, as Daniel Fierstein outlines, then they had experienced decades of stigmatization. And that stigmatization wasn't simply the experience of insults and being demeaned in public. It was a systematic form of stigmatization, which played out in terms of local laws and regulations and denial of certain civil rights. And of course, we've just heard from Niam the way in which the monks, through Mabata and 969 campaigns, have organized and been a conduit for that kind of stigmatization and hate crime. What we found was that in 2012, very explicitly in recent history, that experience of stigmatization moved from the verbal to the physical. So in 2012, pogroms against the Rohingya took place in and around Sittwe. At least 200 people were killed. We don't know the exact number because the Myanmar state has not been in any way inclined to document these killings or to prosecute those involved in the killings. But at the same time, Rohingya homes were burnt to the ground, communities destroyed. And the Rohingya, apart from those in certain villages and apart from those, and I'm talking now about Sittwe, I'm not talking about northern Rakhine State, and I'll come to that in a moment. But the Rohingya of Sittwe in the region were confined then to the ghetto on Mingala, where 4,500 people still live, wholly dependent on the charity of others. And the Rohingya who fled, and they were driven into a particular direction, and they've ended up in an area that we call the detention camp complex and live in about 40 different camps. As I mentioned, in conditions which afford basically bare life. They are places of what Claudia Card might describe as social death. You go into those camps, and for those of you who've been in the camps, I'm sure you will appreciate what I'm saying, that people there are deprived of the ability to engage in livelihood practices. They are deprived of the right to health care. They are deprived of the right to an education. They are deprived of all their civil liberties, of the right of freedom of movement. They are wholly dependent on the World Food Programme, which, while we were there, cut the calorific intake to the Rohingya communities there. So they were forced, as a result of the physical violence in 2012, into spaces of geographical and social isolation. So no longer do the Rohingya of that part of Rakhine State, or any part of Rakhine State now, live and share a life with other ethnic groups. So the Rakhine, who have, as we know, become, well, certainly the extremists among them have become perpetrators. The Rohingya live separate lives, and so there is no intersection. And so it's been much easier for groups like Mabata and the government to demonize the Rohingya, to claim that they're terrorists, to claim that they are business monopolizers, to claim that they threaten the well-being of the dominant ethnic group inside Rakhine State, the Rakhine. And so the physical and geographical isolation has been extremely important in the campaign of genocide against the Rohingya. Those Rohingya living in northern Rakhine State were in some senses already isolated. For those of us who've tried to enter Rakhine State, very few have been able to enter and to conduct systematic work up there. So the Rohingya were isolated from the international community in northern Rakhine State at the same time. And once you've isolated a group, whether it be national, religious or ethnic in this case, it's much easier to weaken them in every other respect. So now, as I mentioned, that the Rohingya have been isolated in ghettos and a number of prison villages, we would call them, where the Rohingya can't leave, and in the camps. It's been very, very straightforward for the Myanmar state to weaken this group to a state of, as I said, bare life. And that's where they continue. I mean, that's the kind of existence that is inflicted upon them. So that was 2014-15 when we published our first report. And we said very explicitly that this was a genocidal process. It was following the pattern of historic genocides. There was no doubt in our minds, on the basis of 176 interviews that we conducted, not only with the Rohingya, but with the Rakhine and with local politicians, with business people, with international communities, that a genocide was underway. And we argued in our final paragraph in that report that unless what we witnessed was recognised as a genocide, we would see the final two stages. And those final two stages are mass annihilation and something called symbolic enactment, which I'll discuss very briefly in a moment. So that was 2015. We wrote to the government at various stages, and the response that we received was always, well, it's not a genocide until a court of law determines it as such. And we know how slowly the wheels of international justice can move. So that's where we were left at that stage. Then in 2017, the story has been well told now, for those of you in this room anyway. The Myanmar state launched its final assault against the Rohingya, and we witnessed mass annihilation in the sense of 800,000 people fleeing northern Rakhine State in a matter of 2 months or so. I mean, the death toll we think is probably around 20,000, but certainly in anybody's books, the Myanmar Rohingya are becoming extinct, if you like, inside Myanmar, and that is a form of annihilation. That is the extermination of the Myanmar Rohingya. We have Rohingya in the diaspora, of course, and certainly in Bangladesh. But the attempt of the Myanmar government was to remove them from Myanmar, and this they have done effectively. And that's what they wanted to do, and that's what genocide is about. The final stage of genocide is something that Daniel Fierstein calls symbolic enactment. It embodies a social reorganisation of the place in which the departed group once lived. And so what we are seeing inside northern Rakhine State now is a complete reorganisation of Rakhine State so as effectively to airbrush the Rohingya from Myanmar's history, from the Rakhine history. And so in the process of the so-called military operations, we know that at least 350 villages were destroyed, burnt and the Rohingya communities were also destroyed. We know that 800,000 or so fled across the border. We know that Rohingya property was appropriated by Rakhine and by the military and by the state. We know that burnt land inside Myanmar reverts to state ownership. And so what we are now witnessing after that initial appropriation, we are now witnessing a second phase of social reorganisation, which is part of every form of state crime, denial, and in the case of this genocide, it's removing sources of evidence of the genocide that's taken place. So even those areas which were destroyed in the fires are now being bulldozed, so that mass graves are being bulldozed. The physical landscape that was so central to Rohingya life and Rohingya history and Rohingya memory is being destroyed. New zonings are taking place. We're seeing the attempt to develop new economic zones. Whether they'll be successful is another question. We're seeing the attempt to change the demography by creating new Buddhist villages in place of Rohingya villages, very reminiscent of what happened to the Palestinians, with Israeli villages planted over the villages destroyed during 1948, during the Nakba. So the parallels with Palestine and with other genocides here are extremely sharp. And this is what is happening inside Myanmar at the moment. The idea, the very concept of the Rohingya, the Myanmar Rohingya, is being dramatically eroded is the wrong word, destroyed. And so that in the history books that will follow, the Rohingya will not be a part of Rakhine history. And that's the intention of the Myanmar state. So I'm not sure for how long I've spoken, probably too long, but that is, I think it's extremely important to understand what has happened to the Rohingya is a genocide, that it is effectively over, but paradoxically it continues, as I mentioned, in terms of the attempts by the Myanmar state to work very hard at removing all trace of the Rohingya. They have a problem because they still have some Rohingya remaining, but those Rohingya, if you like, have been effectively disabled from engaging as Myanmar Rohingya people. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to
Thank you very much indeed, Professor, for clarifying those terms. I think we all needed that reminder, and to understand in a legal context what it means, what's happening to Rohingya people actually means in the legal environment. In a moment, we'll hear from another of our distinguished speakers, Kerry Tunks. But first, I've been asked just to give you a quick glance with on-screen displays of the JFRM committees and officers, so you know a bit more about what this organization looks like. If we go through the names quickly, then we'll save a bit of time, and what I'll do is I'll ask you to please check on our website for fuller bios and details. So there you have the board of directors, Jo Win, who is sitting in the middle of the panel over there, if you don't mind giving a quick wave, Jo Win. And then Dr. Abdullah, who many of you know, Dr. Abdullah Falek. Where are you? There you are. And Dr. Mahira Ruby. Is she here today? Yeah. There she is. Thank you very much. That's the board. Now we move on to the I thought we were doing patrons next. No, steering committees. As you can see, patrons committee, thank you very much for doing that. The patrons are Professor Penny Green, from whom you've just heard, Peter Oborne, who I mentioned earlier. It's worth looking on the internet if you can for his article that came out in the Daily Mail in which he spoke to a survivor of a massacre that happened in one particular town called Tula Toli. It's been very well documented, but Peter has taken it a step further by naming it as genocide. Kiri Tunks, who joins us, and she'll be speaking a little bit later. Dr. Mustafa Ceric, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Thank you very much. Catherine West, from whom we heard an expression of regret that she couldn't be here, but as I say, she's strongly supporting this initiative. Sir Stephen O'Brien, whom some of you may remember as the former OCHA chief, the UN humanitarian leader. Rajiv Dhawan, Dr. Thomas McManus, who I believe is a colleague of yours, Penny, yours, Professor Greens. Also on the Patrons Committee, Professor Syed, Julie Ward, MEP, Ambassador Ibrahim Rasool, Hassan Arif, Prashant Bhushan, another journalist, Richard Cockett, and Justice Mohammed Abdul Rauf. And all of their bios you can hear, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the diversity and number of people who are backing this initiative. Now to the steering committee, Dr. Maria Holt will be joining us. Dr. Mohammed Abdul Bari is MBE, and we'll be hearing from him a little later. Could you give us a quick wave? There you are. He's got a book coming out, or is out already. It's already out, and he'll be telling us a little bit about that at the end of the panel discussion. Tun Kien Ghaffar, who many of you may be familiar with, he's certainly a good friend of mine, and the last time I bumped into him was in Bangladesh. He's made it a point to go there several times to find out what the needs of people are. He leads the British Burmese Rohingya organisation of the UK. Neil Jameson, CBE, Nijam Uddin, from whom we've just heard, Dr. Anita Shug, who many of you may be familiar with. I believe she lives in Germany, but she's a leading Rohingya woman activist. And Victoria Britton, is she here? It's a journalist who many of you may be familiar with. Also on the steering committee, Dr. Anas Altikriti, yours truly, Mark Vermana, who is a veteran of lobbying the British government when it comes to issues in Burma. David Wardrop, Salma Yaqub, Jonathan Fryer, Dilawar Khan, Reverend Bonnie Evans-Hills, Imam Ajmal Masroor, and Sajjad Amin and Sajid Mia. Those names, I think, will be all on the website for you to have a proper look at and to find out more about them. Any further questions, as I said earlier, please do ask Dr. Abdullah or Jorwin. We do have a legal advisory team. Rajiv Dhawan, who was, as you saw on a steering committee a little earlier, Barrister Abdul Razak, Dr. Thomas McManus, Hassan Arif, Justice Mohammed Abdul Rauf, Prashant Bhushan, Sajjad Amin, and Sajid Mia. Are any of those people here at the moment? Thank you. Thank you very much, Abdul Razak, for supporting us. Sorry? Sajid Mia is also in the room? Where? Oh, just left. All right, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for those slides. I believe that's the last. Is that right? In which case, let's move on to the next item on our agenda. You know, we heard briefly there from Professor Green about the different stages through which genocide kind of goes through. Education is very important, obviously, and Kiri can talk about that as president of the National Union of Teachers and our patron. I have here that you are to talk about educating people to avert future massacres.
You've given me the easy subjects, obviously, there. So.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be a patron of this campaign. You know, our union has a long history of taking up international issues, and I should say at the start, I'm certainly not an expert in the Rohingya and what's happening over there, but I've already learned an awful lot. And essentially, I think if you see an injustice happening and you are aware of it, you have a duty to do something about it, and that's certainly what our union has felt about international questions. We are drawn to these things, and we see our union as being seated as part of the community. We understand that our community is made up of diverse people, from diverse communities from all over the world, and that we are connected to those communities through the people that we are married to, the people we live next door to, our classmates, our workmates, you know, and so on. The people whose services, when we use services, the people that treat us in hospitals or the people that serve us in shops. And the idea that we are not connected to a very global community is anathema certainly to my union, and I'm very proud of the stand that we take on international questions. We also understand that we are connected to different communities abroad, and particularly we understand the reach of the British Empire and how huge that has been. We have a very connected history, as we've already been hearing about some of the ways that the British have been complicit and involved in what's been happening in Rakhine. But we also have, I think, a collective responsibility to that history and to its legacy, and to pretend that what happened then is nothing to do with us now is something that I can't really accept. So we've heard from Nijam and others about our history in relation to what's happened to the Rohingya community, and as a union we don't disconnect our day-to-day work. Obviously as a union we have a responsibility to campaign for pay and conditions and so on, but we're not a union that thinks that's all that we do. We see ourselves very much, as I say, seated at the community. Also, as educators, we understand actually that there is a need to help our young people connect with what is going on in the world. As educators, we understand that they are living in a world that they have connections with, that maybe it wasn't as easy to make those connections, so through social media and so on, they are very alert to what is happening around the world. But actually, we don't give them the tools with which to understand or to navigate that world, I don't think, in education. And as a union, that's something that we're very keen to do. So how do we take an issue like this into our schools? Well, at the moment it's very, very hard actually, because there is no space in schools for anything that isn't about getting Progress 8 results for your school and making sure your school doesn't fall down the league table. So that's a more general issue with how we actually bring questions of international justice into our schools and make sure that young people are informed, that they are able to ask intelligent questions, that they're not, you know, they don't just believe what they hear or see on social media, and that they are actually able to come to kind of really independent, well thought out positions on things. We have taken up a lot of trade union issues. As a trade union, we've taken up a lot of international issues. Kenya, Turkey, Palestine, we've got a very good reputation and record of working in Palestine. But we also take up issues in Iran, in Latin America and so on. And now we have taken up the question of Myanmar. We've started to make links with the Rohingya community, in fact through Najim and some colleagues of ours who work in Bradford. And we were lucky enough to hear Najim speak to our conference with Sirajul, his brother, at Easter, and they brought the hall to a stand in a very emotional ovation. So moved was the conference by the speeches that Nijam and Sirajul made. And we've already started to take action on this. So we've already written to Boris Johnson and demanded that he take action. We've just actually now written a letter with the British Rohingya community and Show Racism the Red Card, a letter to Leeds United Football Club to say that they shouldn't be touring Myanmar, and to say that we want them to stop. And that's a campaign that we will be spreading out amongst our members, but also we hope into our schools, because obviously sport is something that our young people are very concerned about. Today we've just agreed to take up some other initiatives to support the Rohingya community and the aims of kind of getting justice for them. I think it's important for teachers to practice what we preach and to do what we say. You know, we talk a lot about British values, about human rights, about justice, about equality, and I think you can't just teach those things. It's not something that you just do as an exercise in the book. You actually have to practice them. You actually have to live them. And I think if our young people don't see our teachers standing up for these questions in our day-to-day lives, outside the classroom, inside the classroom, they have a right to ask us what kind of role models we are to them. So I think as a union we take that very, very seriously. We want a curriculum in which young people have the time and space to explore these issues. I have to say, as I've already said, it is very hard to do that at the minute, and so one of the campaigns that we have as a union is to try and make sure that the curriculum is more responsive to the needs of our young people, but also more responsive to the events of the outside world. So we're trying to fight against this rigid testing regime, and trying to teach them things that can't be measured. How do you measure empathy? How do you measure that in an exam? You can't measure that. And at the minute, if you can't measure it, we're not allowed to teach it. So I think all of us as a community have to challenge that mindset that says this issue, these international issues, any issues of equality and social justice, we have to challenge the mindset that says these are not things we cover in our schools. There absolutely must be things that we cover in our schools, because otherwise we leave our young people to go and find out about them in other places where maybe they're not going to get the best counsel and the best guidance about stuff, or be supported to find the right information. I'm really honoured. I'm not going to speak for very long because, as I've said, I am not an expert in this area. But what I bring, I suppose, to you, instead of my expertise on the Rohingya, is a lifetime of campaigning, a lifetime of lobbying, a lifetime of working with various campaigns to try and get justice for various people, or to try and improve the education system in this country. And I think I'm going to be able to bring that kind of experience, that kind of energy and drive, perhaps, to help push through some of the very important things that we've heard other people on this panel say we need to do. So that's what I'm going to bring here to you and to the campaign. I know that the campaign needs money, so I'm going to plug again the need for you to donate to make all this fantastic work possible. And just to reiterate again, if we as adults do not stand up for what is right, if we do not stand up for equality and justice, and our young people look at us, then we are letting them down, we are letting ourselves down. We have a duty to do the right thing and to be seen to do the right thing, and you being here tonight is part of that. So thank you so much for supporting this campaign.
Thanks very much, Kiri Tunks. I'd like to turn now to the eminent Ben Emerson, QC. He, and very eminent, you'll be speaking about the rights under international law for the forcibly displaced and persecuted. In other words, the people that we're talking about do have rights. Are they being met?
Actually, that's not what I'm going to talk about, but it's within the same ballpark. Let me, first of all, introduce myself and explain why I'm here. I come at this from three different perspectives professionally. So I have, in the past as a lawyer, represented victims of genocide. I was, for a time, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism and Human Rights, and of course, at root, the operations that have resulted in the mass displacement of people and the commission of grave crimes are characterized as counter-terrorism operations. So it's been an important part of my function to understand, not just in Myanmar, all over the world, the ways in which terrorism is used as a pretext for wider political objectives that go way beyond any proportionate response to a threat. And thirdly, and perhaps most pertinently, I sit as a judge in the International Criminal Tribunals for Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, where in both jurisdictions we've had to look at cases involving findings of genocide. Certainly, we'll look in just a moment at why the names matter, because it is extremely important that we get our terminology correct, because the consequences of how you characterize particular grave human rights breaches are very significant from an international law point of view. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'm extremely privileged to have been asked to help shape the legal strategy for this campaign, and I'm honoured partly because I think it's the first time in history that, faced with indolence, inaction and indifference by the international community, a victim community from gross human rights violations have organised whilst those violations are continuing in order to seek justice on their own, have mobilised. It's an extraordinary achievement. We didn't see it in Rwanda because, of course, it's unusual for there to be an effectively organised diaspora where there is a victim community for such grave situations. But what I think, I wanted to just pick up on one of the things that Jason McHugh said earlier on, which is that what we're guided by here is what do we mean by justice? And the words have been sort of used interchangeably in the conversation, but I think it's important to keep them separate. We're talking about something which looks to accountability for the commission of grave crimes, on the one hand, and reparations for the victims of those crimes on the other hand. They're two completely different things, and both have their own unique challenges. Accountability has a particular challenge because you need, one way or another, to engage the authorities either of a state or of an international organisation to secure accountability for crimes as grave as these. Reparations, on the other hand, that is to say compensation and prevention of recurrence and so forth, the right to truth. These are constituent elements of reparations which can be achieved without a state initiating them. In other words, they can be achieved by an organised community such as this, bringing proceedings in an appropriate jurisdiction. So what are the jurisdictions and what are the avenues and opportunities here? Well, first of all, let's look at the word genocide. I mean, we've talked about how this is recognised as a modern form of genocide. I mean, one of the problems with genocide is that, as a concept in the law, is that it is highly subjective in the way in which it is interpreted. And as a result, it often happens that it's not until after a genocide is over that anybody is willing to call it a genocide. Whatever you do, do not use the G word. And why? Because if you do use the G word, you are bound as a state, any state in the world who is a signatory to the Genocide Convention is bound to take action up to and including military action to prevent the continuation of the genocide. So, I mean, during the course of the Rwandan conflict, which was undeniably and recognisably genocidal, the big debate in the US State Department was, how do we stop anyone from acknowledging that this is a genocide? Because if it is, we will have to put troops on the ground. And that's why you'll see such resistance in the public domain to anyone acknowledging that this is a genocide. Because as soon as Boris Johnson, for example, says, yes, I agree, it's a genocide, the next thing is that the United Kingdom is legally obliged to intervene. How does one decide whether it's a genocide from the legal point of view? I mean, as I say, you would be surprised at some of the distinctions that are drawn. So in the Yugoslavian context, the Srebrenica massacre was identified as a genocide, whereas the massacre of Croatian civilians in the first Serbian offensive was not classified as a genocide. And how and why does that come about? The oddity about the concept of genocide is that you need to be able to show, or the prosecutor needs to be able to show, or the party complaining of genocide needs to be able to show an intention to destroy an ethnic group as such, those words, as such, destroy them as such. But it doesn't have to be the destruction of the entire ethnic group. It can be a portion of that group, but you must destroy them as such. And obviously, what on earth does that mean? It means whatever anybody wants it to mean. So in Srebrenica, it was a massacre of 10,000 Bosnian Muslim men who had been separated conveniently by the UN peacekeeping troops and handed over to Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic. Now, in that context, 10,000 people was sufficient to constitute a genocide, whereas a much larger number of Croatian civilians, but not killed in such a concentration, were found not to be a genocide by the International Court of Justice. So you have to ask yourself what distinguishes those situations, and at the end of the day, it is that question of feel and smell, and is it done with genocidal intent? Does it have the hallmarks of genocide? So when people talk about the hallmarks of genocide, that is because it's not categorically possible for anyone to say legally this is or this is not a genocide in the context where an ethnic group is being targeted for systematic conduct of this kind. But I entirely agree with Penny's analysis that the evidence here, as a whole, amounts to a systemic, prolonged, intentional campaign to dehumanise and then to destroy the Rohingya as such. And it is really undebatable, I think, that in a modern concept of genocide, if this isn't genocide, what is genocide? What is the point of genocide any longer in a modern world? Because this is the form that genocide takes. So that's the first question. That's why the names matter. That's why it matters, because the moment we get to cross that threshold, there is an obligation now, right here, right now, at the moment, for states to use up to military action to intervene. And they don't want to say that until after an event is over, when they no longer can commit troops. So if it's not a genocide, let's say for the sake of argument that the avenues are challenging for establishing that it's genocide. Yes, you can get a lot of international lawyers. I would suggest the majority of genuinely independent, open-minded international lawyers with an appropriate access to a reliable body of evidence would come to the conclusion that on a modern definition this is genocide. But let's assume for a moment that we're not in a position to do that at this stage. There is still, under modern international law, an obligation on states to intervene under the responsibility to protect doctrine that was invoked first of all by the Blair government in bombing Serbia during the Kosovo crisis. It's an obligation to intervene to prevent humanitarian disaster. In that instance, the mass displacement of Kosovo Albanians in a freezing winter across the Albanian mountains into huge refugee camps. I mean, you can see the parallel. And similarly, the Albanian minority in Serbia was the majority in Kosovo. And so you have a similarly persecuted minority who were excluded from state school education and from using their own language, who were then being driven out by Belgrade and by the might of a genuine military campaign, and undoubtedly a genocidal one which was designed to remove the Albanian population entirely from Kosovo. And as I say, they were the majority in Kosovo. So I mean, I agree entirely with Penny that ethnic cleansing is a dangerous term because it doesn't mean anything in law. It just describes, it's a description of the motive for a widespread and systematic violence and gross human rights violations. The motive is to clean the area of a particular ethnic group. But that's all it is. It's a political term rather than a legal term. The question is, what form of conduct, how do you classify in legal terms what any particular action is? So no doubt that we have a humanitarian disaster, no doubt that there is currently a justification at the very least, if not an obligation, in international law for states to intervene and put a stop to this, but they don't and they haven't. And so people have watched on their television screens the mass exodus, but they don't go any deeper into it than that. The understanding is limited to the fact, I think, in public, that there's been a mass movement of people and some sort of persecution. But what really is absolutely critical here is what it is causing these people to leave their homes. People don't leave their homes in these kinds of numbers, 670,000 in one go, unless something pretty terrible is happening in the area from which they are fleeing. And that is where the focus needs to be, on the crimes that are being committed and have been committed on a horrific scale. I mean, these are classic gross human rights violations, gross and systematic rapes, massacres, torture, false imprisonment, on a horrific scale. But you don't see hardly any reporting about what it is that brought these people into Bangladesh. And where do you in the end get the evidence for war crimes, investigations and prosecutions? Almost invariably from refugee populations in refugee camps who have fled this kind of violence, or in IDP camps. That's where you find the evidence. And so somebody's got to start looking and getting the evidence in a form in which it can be sensibly documented and used. And that's a very, very challenging exercise in this context. So that's the macro international law position. We then move to the next level, if you like, down, which is looking at what the accountability mechanisms are. In this context, one needs to distinguish carefully between war crimes, which can only be committed in or in the context of an armed conflict, and there's a serious debate about whether that threshold can be crossed in the Myanmar context, and crimes against humanity, which can be committed in any situation where there is a widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population. So that's like one down from genocide. You can't prove, let's say, in any given situation, that you have an intention to destroy an ethnic population as such, but you can show there's been widespread and systematic attacks and crimes committed against the civilian population. In that situation, those responsible are guilty of crimes against humanity, irrespective of whether there's been an armed conflict or not. And at the moment, the ICC prosecutor has begun just such an investigation in connection with the Rohingya, but that relates only to the crime of forced deportation. So forced deportation is a crime under the Rome Statute, but in general terms it hasn't been used. It's been investigated in terms of forced displacement of people in the West Bank, but that's an inconclusive and ongoing investigation. It's been investigated in the context of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, but that also is an ongoing situation. In relation to the Rohingya, she can only investigate the events that take place in a signatory state. And the only signatory state here is Bangladesh. And therefore, because Bangladesh is a signatory to the Rome Statute and Myanmar is not, she has to have found a crime that crosses the border. And the real question for us is going to be how far we can get her to force her investigations to include what made them cross the border in the first place. It doesn't mean to say that she will ever have jurisdiction to prosecute, but it may be that she can find ways of extending the jurisdiction by asking that fundamental question. And then the other objective of achieving accountability through the international criminal law route is to get the Security Council to extend the jurisdiction of the statute to cover Myanmar, which they've done, for example, in Sudan or in other non-signatory states. It's a challenge because the Security Council is, as you know, dominated by the Permanent Five, which includes Russia and China, and even the Americans are not very fond of referring at the moment to the ICC or doing anything to support it. But that has to be part of our direct focus here, is to extend the jurisdiction of the prosecutor, because there's no doubt that she has the appetite to address the Rohingya situation, because she's shown by asking for permission and getting it of the court to open an investigation in the Bangladesh side. So that's the broad territory as far as crimes against humanity are concerned. Now, as Jason touched upon, any of these crimes, or many of these crimes, are what we call crimes of universal jurisdiction. That include torture and many of the other crimes under the Rome Statute, which means that any country, anywhere in the world, can prosecute any perpetrator anywhere in the world, providing they meet the jurisdictional requirements of their own domestic law. So this country could prosecute a Myanmar general who set foot in the United Kingdom if the evidence was there and the case was there, and that's the relevance of having, if you like, prosecution packs available so that lawyers can move quickly in jurisdictions where perpetrators arrive unexpectedly. So that's another dimension to the private prosecution or the public prosecution under universal jurisdiction principles. But then the last element to this, which it seems to me is absolutely squarely worth exploiting for the first time, I mean, I say the first time, there is one ongoing case in relation to North Sudan, where an oil company is being investigated in Sweden for complicity in the commission of war crimes. And the world is, the legal community is watching that case, because obviously if they are convicted, it will suggest that corporate entities that get themselves intermingled with conflicts or crises such as this and stand to benefit from the commission of crimes may ultimately have to pay up for those crimes, or their insurers may. And one of the key elements of the strategy that Jason and his team will be working on is identifying corporate defendants with deep pockets and going after them. Because there are corporate defendants whose, on the face of it, stand to have benefited significantly, let's put it no higher than that at this stage, from the mass clearances. And the question will be identifying them, identifying where their headquarters are, and identifying what we can do to establish investigations into their culpability, and then going after them. I mean, going after them for massive sums of money, you know, in order that we can do something by way of reparation for the victim community here, which they ain't going to get through the international mechanisms being self-motivated. So what we have here is a unique, I think, historic moment, an opportunity for this community, which has suffered just so unspeakably, to galvanise and to start taking back control of the legal space, because at the moment they are left at the mercy of people who have no selfish states that have no self-interested motivation in assisting them. And since there's no, I mean, that's the bottom line in international law, states are self-motivated according to their own interests. They don't do things by and large for purely humanitarian reasons. Occasionally they have done, but it's not the usual pattern. But if ever there was a situation where an organised response from the international community was called for, which was effective and decisive, it was this, and we've seen a really pusillanimous failure to act. And so, as I say, I'm very pleased to have been asked, proud to lend my weight to this initiative, because I truly believe that we can, with the right resources, do something to seek to lay responsibility where it belongs, not just at the feet of the lower perpetrators, but right up to the top of those who are responsible, and at the same time to find ways of laying responsibility at the feet of corporates who've profited from gross and systematic human rights violations. So that's why I'm here.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Emerson. Actually, when you were talking about documenting such atrocities, and I just came across people who lived in one village, and it hasn't been reported yet in the main media, mainstream media, and there were 17 people killed, boys killed. The village was mined. I met 2 women who admitted to have been raped, and I met women who saw their children and their husbands being killed in front of their eyes and then being raped. And they were found unconscious the next day by their neighbors, naked on the floor in the kitchen where they were raped.
It's unspeakable.
It is absolutely unspeakable, but the survivors say their only hope is with the international community. We hope that the international community will blah, blah, blah. And I say, anything else? And they say, no. We hope that the international community, it's our responsibility. And I think it's a human obligation for me personally. I mean, I can't see this happen to fellow humans. Turning now to Jo Wyn, a good old friend who has advised me many times, very wise and very experienced. And I think most importantly, your view on how Burma works. Because a lot of people still come to me and ask, why do they hate Muslims so much? Why are they doing this to Rohingya? And I think we need to point out as well that it's not just Rohingya that are facing such atrocities. I think in recent days we've heard a lot about war crimes in Kachin, haven't we? Do you want to take it up, Jo Wyn?
Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. And thank you so much for all your patience, and I'm really grateful for your attending here. And yes, as Veronica said, in Burma, for since 1963, anti-Muslim persecution has been very, very strong and very systematic. And it is institutionalized persecution, very systematic and very effectively. You know, those who did tremendous research and for example, like Mr. Richard Coker here, available today in front of us. We are very lucky you have you here. And he did a tremendous, very good effort, and he wrote a book, and such as Penny Green also did a lot of research we have here today. And there are several authors, those who have been written about anti-Muslim persecution in Burma. But the thing here is, what is the goal of the perpetrators? What do they want? Why they are after Muslims? And actually, this is not the only Muslims. They are also after ethnic Christian minorities, whereas Kachin, Shan, Karen, Shansak, Buddhists as well. So what is the ultimate goal of these people? As my colleague said earlier, Nijam, they have one state, one religion, one ethnicity, one culture, that type of crazy mindset, which inherited from fascism and ultranationalism. Because if we look back to the history, Burma struggle for independence movement based on nationalism. But the moment when we achieved independence, the ultranationalism did not diminish. It continued, and it took another phase, another level. And at that time, the politicians, instead of having long-term wisdom for the future, they took the political benefit for their own party, for their own benefits, for their own political career. And that's very unfortunate situation. But after that military rule, so General Nevin took power, the country is totally changed. So that is the foundation of the anti-Muslim persecutions and that working until today. And because this is very rigid and very systematic. For example, there is a 6 objective in 1963. They established 6 objectives. With this 6 objective says that there is no Muslim in the military, no Muslim in the police, no Muslim in politicians, no Muslim in the parliament, no Muslim in the intellectuals, and no Muslim in the wealthy or businessman. So this is the ultimate goal, the main objective of this strategy. And during the 1963, Muslims have 80% of Muslim control 80% of Burma economics, and there was a huge markets and business institutions has been built by the Indian Muslims and also local Burmese Muslims. But after this strategy has been implemented, in today, barely 4 or 5% left under the Muslim control. And we talk about the parliament, under the recent democratic government, we have no Muslim representative in parliament, whereas Muslim has at least 10% populations. So this is a very systematic persecution which is actively very working now. And the Rohingya populations are about 30% of the Muslim population. So Burma has a 55 million population, where officially Muslims are 4%, but actually Muslims are more than 10%. The reason why they are downplaying the population, because they want to show that Muslims are insignificant populations and they are not representing any local area in the parliament. So Muslims are more than 10% populations, and among them Rohingyas are at least 30%. And now we have only less than 200 or 300,000 Rohingya remain in Burma. And there should be at least 3 million Rohingya populations. And 90% of them are now exiled. And they are living in Saudi, Europe, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. And now most of them are in Bangladesh. So what is the next after that? Me and my team, I'm a executive director of Burma Human Rights Network. And so we been doing the research on the other cities about the citizenships. So citizenship is one of the key things for a person to have a human right, to get human rights and be treated as equal as a human being. And it's very important in a country to get all the access to the legal and healthcare and everything. So citizenship is the most important thing in Burma. When we studied research, when we did research in Karen states, there are only around about 20% of Muslims who have citizenships. What about 80%? They have no citizenships. And they don't even know this is required, this is important for them, for their life. And they believe that lack of education also, they believe that they have a birthright because they've been living here for life. So citizenship has been very systematically taken away from Rohingya, from the Muslim in Burma. Now they are introducing new system that called NVC, Nationality Verification Card. And there is some dangerous key point here. The dangerous point is when you are going to, immigration officers can take away someone's citizenship if they doubt how you obtain this. And then they will replace it with the NVC card, which has no limitations. It can be forever. And you have no right to vote, you have no right to go for higher education. This is very strong discrimination on every Muslim in Burma. So they have achieved. We have failed the Rohingya community, and Rohingya community has been ethnic cleansed and faced genocide, and they are finished in Burma, and now they are turning towards other Muslim minorities. So I think this is why I'm very strongly raising this issue is when international community aware that what's going up one after another, because Rohingya people are suffering not just yesterday or a few days ago. They have been facing this discrimination since 1978. And 1991, there was a heinous, discrimination law has been implemented. Rohingya men are not allowed to marry without any permissions, and they have to apply for this, and it will take 2 years. If you married yourself without permission, you will be jailed for 5 years, and you cannot take more than 2 children. So if you have more than 2 children, what's going to happen? So you have to hide these children. Every year in January, the immigration department will visit those local immigration department will visit your house, and they take the pictures with your family. And if anyone decrease or reduce or increase, you have to answer for this. So if you have more than 2 children, your child have to transfer to different locations in order to save your child for yourself. So this kind of discrimination is like a story for us maybe, but they are facing daily, and they cannot travel from one village to another for the medical cost. Let me explain to you. We did research in 2016. In refugee camps, people have no money, no access to healthcare. So they have to, when they need to go to the hospital, they need to apply to the local government. They have to apply to the authorities to get the police protection, which costs $100. They don't have any income. So they beg everyone, because everyone save rice as a currency. So they secure rice for their food, yeah? And they donate rice, and they collect all the rice from everyone and sell it to the Rakhine and the other people. It will take at least 1 week or 2 weeks, all this process. Maybe somebody cannot survive this. Their health situation is such a grave, they cannot survive. And when they reach to the hospital, they've been treated very badly. So this is how this has been happening since 1978. So this is not a new for them. And what about other non-Rohingya people? In Rangoon now, Muslim housemates are not employed by the Buddhist household. Muslim households are afraid to employ Buddhist housemates. Why all this happening? I have never seen in my lifetime this kind of discrimination, this kind of segregations. Anything happen with the Muslim, you have to be compensated to the Buddhist, no matter whether you are right or wrong, because everyone will support the Buddhist man or woman. So this is a legal system in Burma also different for the other and Muslims and other Buddhists. So recently 7 Muslims has been jailed for praying outside, because that location mosques are there is no mosque, they are not allowed to build mosques. For information, since 1962, non-Buddhist religious premises are not allowed to build anymore. So there is no new Christian churches, no new mosque since 1962. So where there are many locations, Muslims and Christians doesn't have a place to practice their religion. If you go outside of your premises, you will be arrested. So these are the very compelling issues that compelling us to take some stance, take some positions to do something for these vulnerable people. So me and my some of colleagues, we come together and we come to this step, and we feeling that GFRM has a very key, important role to play here. In my understanding, I would like to highlight this very important because the main objective of the GFRM is to work on illegal challenges, to take Burmese authorities, in those who involved in the crime against humanity against the Rohingya people, and which has been committed since recently, that exponentially worsened since 2016. We proudly have amongst us a very strong and very number of legal minds, and I think brilliant and legal minds, just those who are very strongly compassionate what's happening with the Rohingya people, and I think they have a capability to create a formidable challenges for those who committed crime against humanity against Rohingya people in Burma. And this is the aim of the JFRM, to go through every legal avenue, to create a legal consequences for the perpetrators in Burma. And finally, our ultimate goal, as I said, work toward a safe, voluntary and rightful repatriation of the Rohingya people to their homes, with the dignity and security. Those conditions will have to include citizenship rights and protections of human rights and protection from any victimizations or violence. Also, we are, within our mind, we believe that collectively and work together to help the Rohingya people and push for the changes. And this horrific persecution must be end. And we need to remain vigilant and active to keep the Rohingya issues alive until they are all repatriated with all rights. And in my last word, I would like to say that in the face of great wrongs, it becomes a duty for every one of us to fight for justice. And I think JFRM has started today, and I hope it will achieve our goal. And thank you very much for your patience and listening.
Every so often in the camps, these mega camps in Bangladesh, there are demonstrations against forced repatriation, because there's talk about moving them to an island or going to these camps, these model camps where they would not be able to leave, as the Myanmar army chief has just enunciated. Now, you'll be amazed when you go to the camps at how many children there are. So most of the demonstrators are, in fact, children. And they, in these very high voices, they say in Rohingya, Arabi Sharsai, we want justice. Very high, childish voices. It's almost as if they're playing a game, but what they want is deadly serious. And I really hope that JFRM is one way of saying, we have your backs. There is a new book coming out, I understand, about the Rohingya. The author joins us, and I hope that you can tell us a little bit about that, just as a kind of punctuation mark to our events today. Thank you very much indeed. Here you are, Dr. Mohammed Abdul Bari.
Thank you, Veronica. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and good evening. I'm not a speaker. I have heard people, Rohingya brother, Burmese Muslim, and others speaking, and I think they're wonderful in the sense that this JFRM has got its foot on the basis of what you have all said. So it's a journey that collectively we have taken. I'll just say a few things about the book. I'm not a speaker. I have been a lifelong community activist, civil society activist, involving involved with a few organizations like Citizens UK, Muslim Council of Britain. I was part of London Olympics as well in 2012. But I sort of turned into an academic or writer in recent decade. But on the day, 25th of August, I remember when the mass exodus of Rohingya people, I call it a biblical proportion, 25th August, and for the first 6 weeks probably, 400,000 to 500,000 Rohingya people crossed the border, and with all their horrible stories. And I was shocked, it shook me. I have a little bit of connection, and my humanity came in such a way that I couldn't, I didn't know what to do. I had been a charity worker all my life as well. I thought, should we go and raise some charity money? I did that in the beginning with some other, like Abdullah Falik. Then I thought that, why don't I write a book, short book, so that this is a summary of what is happening with information that I know. I went to Burma, I went to Mandalay, talked to Rohingya Muslims, Burmese Muslims, and some brothers and sisters in here, and someone like Penny Green and others helped me. So this is the book, short book, around 100 pages. And in this, I have more or less tried to summarize what the speakers have said and what should be done. First word of genocide came to my knowledge on this from Professor Amartya Sen in 2015.
Yes. The slow burning genocide.
Yes, slow burning. And then Penny Green, in her wonderful book, Iski, and called it a genocide. Yale University called it a genocide. And quite a few other people have called it a genocide. So what I have collected this information, the definition of genocide, and Penny Green's hopefully new report is coming. We should call a spade a spade. And the lawyers have said that unless genocide word is not used, G word is not used, the world today is a broken world. This Security Council in the United States, that's paralyzed. But if we as civil society organizations, individuals and bodies, Muslims, non-Muslims from across the world, across the country, try to create an environment and pressure, a campaign that our government, European governments and other people are more or less those who are still dithering, they call it a genocide, only then probably UN can initiate something. But whether we are hopeful or not, that's another issue. But I think civil society organizations can do really, really wonderful things. When Archbishop Desmond Tutu says something about Aung San Suu Kyi, that affects. When Dalai Lama calls something about Suu Kyi, her performance, disingenuity, then it affects the humanity. So we need more people, and Bob Geldof and others, we need more people who are very iconic figures in the world to come on board. We need activists to come on board. That's why these patrons and the steering group and the legal board and people like Veronica and others, and I'm sure many of you who have been listening to this and probably are not fully aware of what's going to happen with the JFRM, please do try to help us. And at the end of the day, it's our human responsibility that you mentioned. We are all human beings, and the sufferings of Rohingya, as Penny Green has mentioned about the Palestine and others have mentioned of the Bosnia. So this is a sort of unfortunately ongoing thing. But what is happening in Myanmar, taking out the citizenship and not even recognizing their ethnic identity, this is, I don't think history has ever seen like this in human, one human being's treatment about the others. Anyway, so very briefly, it's just a small book, concise book, and my main purpose was to...
What's it called?
It's called The Rohingya Crisis, A People Facing Extinction. The purpose for me is to just keep this issue alive, because people may forget. This organization, small books like that, there are academic books, I have read them, But small books like this are geared to sort of make sure that Bangladeshi community diaspora or Rohingya diaspora community or other diaspora community, there is a global conference going on Muslim diaspora in Istanbul. So the diaspora community has a particular role, as well as the indigenous community have particular roles to keep this issue alive in their own countries, and the legal growth and whatever role we can take is a matter of discussion, consultation. So this JFRM is evolving in that sense, and we need your help and cooperation and support. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. One thing that I don't think people have mentioned is that this is going on still. Every day, 100 to 150 people cross the border into Bangladesh. I heard from people who remained in a village called Maunjidong, where allegedly a massacre took place. I talked to him on the phone, and they desperately need food. Since August the 25th, we spoke to him last month, so that's April. They have only had one delivery of food from the WFP. They have had no health services at all. There are mines planted around their village. They desperately need help. It's still happening. We act as if the genocide, it's not, this is not post factum, this is ongoing. And that's another reason for me why this is so urgent that something is done. We don't have very much time, but I would like to open the floor to a couple of questions if you have them, and if our panelists would be so kind as to take them. Do you mind if I'm very, very bossy? And, well, Joe Wynn's used to me. You know what, I'm very interested to understand why our Buddhist nun is here. Because a lot of people, they think it's a religious thing. Do you mind if I ask? Why? Why you're here? It's me being very bossy, so if you don't want to answer, that's all right. I'll ask somebody else.
We are just interested to find out what's going on.
Yes, and you've seen the name Buddhism come up as kind of enemies. How does that make you feel as a Buddhist?
It's terrible.
I'm sorry.
Because we Buddhists don't believe in any war.
Yeah. Thank you very much. All right, we don't have that much time, so a couple, please, from the floor. Thank you. Who are there? There are more than 2 lawyers, I believe. Aren't there?
For the 2 who are doing the legal representations, what exact period are you looking at? As people have said, this has been going on for decades.
Sorry, can you say who you are as well?
It's just a question. So, yeah, what exact period are you looking for reparations and for accountability for? Thank you.
I mean, the short answer to that is whatever period the evidence gives us to disclose as a claim. And so, I mean, there is no limit in time going backwards for these crimes.
Are you likely to limit yourself to the time that the ICC might specify?
Well, I mean, obviously we have to, there are all sorts of technical questions like jurisdiction of the ICC and when it came into force. You can't bring a case in relation to events that took place before the ICC statute came into force unless the Security Council has mandated a particular situation. So time limits are, I mean, that's, in a way, it's a granular question of detail that will depend when we get to the point whether we were able to breathe life into accountability or reparations within a particular time frame.
Okay, thank you.
There's somebody, Richard. Hello.
Richard Cockett. I'm a patron. A very good evening. Thank you very much for all your comments. It's a great organisation and an idea, and we much need it. My quick question also to all the lawyers is this. This is more of a sort of mind-clearing question, taking up what Wim was saying at the end. I mean, what's happened to Rohingya in Myanmar has happened to almost every other ethnic group in Myanmar since 1963. Yes. The reason the genocide of the Rohingya has been so efficient is they've spent 50 years practicing this. on the Kachin, on the Chan, on the Chin, and everybody else. So my question to you really is, why prosecute the generals, etc., for the genocide of the Rohingya when they've done exactly the same to these other ethnic groups in the past? And so if I was a Kachin or a Chin, would I find it odd that the Rohingya are getting this special favour from all of us and not them? And I suppose that leads on to another question, which is, does it support our case if we take in what's happened to the Chin and the Shan, etc., as supporting evidence that these are practices that have been going for 40 years and that they've subjected many ethnic groups to all this in Myanmar, not just the Rohingya?
Can I just point out that there are some aspects to the persecution of the Rohingya that have not happened to other ethnic minorities. For example, the need to have a license to marry, the need to have a license to have more than 2 children. That is unique for the Rohingya.
On paper, yes, but in practice, they have been subject to most of the restrictions that the Rohingya have been restricted to, in practice. For instance, I mean, they are all citizens, a major difference for Rohingya, but that has not saved any of them from being banned from marrying Burmese, from being able to work in the civil service, in government, etc., etc. That's how Myanmar works.
Did you want...
I think, again, the answer is the same, which is the further back in time you go, the harder it is to get the evidence to bring a case. And we're confronted with a current situation of a pressing nature, which is an immediate crisis where nobody has done anything to intervene, and where there's been a movement of 670,000 people. I mean, I appreciate that is just the event that's the latest in a long line, but that's not a reason for not tackling the current situation, because others in the past have suffered historical wrongs as well. I mean, let's get to the historical wrongs if we get anywhere near that point. But we've got enough at this point to deal with the current crisis. There is some hope that we may be able to effect practical change on the ground, either bringing about accountability for those responsible, or finding some means of reparation, prevention of recurrence, rights, truth, and so forth. And those opportunities are long lost for events of...
This is not historical. This is happening to the Kachin at this very moment as we speak. It's not a matter of history.
If you just take the time issue out of it, and we worked in Darfur on an issue, and if you looked at the Darfur situation, it's not so dissimilar. The accusations of genocide and crimes against humanity that were being pushed then were against different tribes and actually different religious sects, so I think it's pretty similar. And it was helpful and supportive to get an overall picture of similar fact coming through.
Did you want to say something? There's a lady behind you who...
Just on Kachin, I mean, something that Penny mentioned. I mean, I went to Liza, which is non-governmental controlled area in.
Are you human rights?
No, I was doing malaria projects there. So. And we went to Liza, which is a non-government controlled area by the KIO, and on the way you could see villages where Kachin people had been living and they'd been displaced to out of the way, and there were bulldozers, so it's kind of going through their villages, destroying it wasn't just houses decaying naturally, they were being deliberately bulldozed. And in terms of the religion, there were churches that were being again bulldozed with, and then on top a Buddhist temple would be placed. So it was just reminding me of what you were saying. So I think whatever you do is fantastic. Whatever accountability you do is fantastic. But I guess we are seeing patterns, and so therefore it all reinforces the case. Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a really good point that Richard's made and that you've just made. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Because the treatment of the Kachin is just utterly appalling. And I think that we held a People's Tribunal into the persecution of both the Rohingya and the Kachin and other ethnic groups in Myanmar. And I think it will strengthen the campaign if that is understood by this particular group. So I think it's actually critical. And I think part of the reason that the Rohingya have captured at some level through a humanitarian crisis the hearts of people is because, and I'm not passing judgment, is that they don't have a military wing in the way that the Kachin do. And the Kachin are in civil war with the Myanmar state, and the Rohingya have just been annihilated. And I think that's part of the answer to your question, Richard. But I do think it's essential. I mean, you know, solidarity of those not only inside Myanmar, but the parallels, as we've mentioned already, with the Palestinians, are really, really sharp.
I don't think we've got time. I can see a lot of hands going up now, and I don't think that we have time to do those because we've got quite a few things to say. But if I can just mention that in many conversations that I've had with Burmese people of different ethnicities, I've talked about equal civil rights for all. But it's just not something that is in the Burmese culture, but this idea of equal civil rights for all, irrespective of your ethnicity, creed, religion. I need to mention a few things, because we do have to give up this space at 8:30, which is now, so I'm running a bit late. I need to thank you all for attending, and especially if I can ask you for a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so very much for generously sharing your input. I just also need to announce that on the 3rd, that we are having on the 3rd of June, a Rohingya genocide anniversary and book launch at the London Muslim Centre. The details are to be published on the website. I believe we have a slide for this. There you go. As you've seen, you've heard from Dr. Muhammad Abdul Bari about his being there. Ramadan starts next week, doesn't it? This Friday. Yeah. So iftar will be nice to join them for iftar for that. And then thank you very much for your help, all the volunteers on this as we launch our initiative, particularly to Doina. Hello, Doina. Hello. Thank you. Once again, may I remind you that we are reliant on you for donations and support. I understand, sorry gentlemen, I know that you're speaking loudly because you want to be heard by everyone, but please, this is a conversation that is only just starting now. There will be much more that will be said, there will be more forums, and we are very, very open to hearing from you as things develop. This is a very fluid point that we're at the moment with this launch, and I hope it is inclusive. Thank you very much indeed. I'm Veronica Pedrosa. Thank you for coming. Sorry, I didn't have time at the end because of the... Yeah. Okay.
Oh, lovely. Lovely to meet you. Good. Excellent. Yeah, pleasure. Hello, how are you?
Over there was giving me a fine grade.
Mau semboyan tenang, kau tahu saya?
Practical implication on getting
Oh, I've got one. I've got one.
It's just something I would like to share with
I'm as slow as you, though. You know, we'll get it done eventually.
Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, can we just quickly do a group picture of the